Hello. We would like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that people today are joining us from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. My name is Jennifer Jacoby. I'm a professor in Health and Exercise Sciences and Faculty of Health and Social Development, and I am the chair for the MSERC Women in Science and Engineering for the BC Yukon region. I am very pleased to be here today to listen to today's presentation and to introduce this amazing guest that we have in front of you. Before I go much further, what I'd like to do is identify that this session is being closed captioned. So if you have the closed captioning box in front of you, and it's not where you want it to be, you can drag and move that closed caption box by clicking on it, dragging to wherever you would like, or you can also turn off that closed captioning box by selecting live transcript. It's a button on the menu bar, and then you can close the live closed captioning. If you have questions, please type those questions into the chat box during the presentation, and then I will be able to read them at the end of the presentation, and they will be addressed at that point in time. Now, today's event is brought to you by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan. Today's session is Defying the Odds, Positive Adaptation in the Context of Family Adversity. Today's presenter is Dr. Sarah Dow-Fleisner. She is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work in the Faculty of Health and Social Development at UBC Okanagan here in Kelowna, British Columbia. And she is the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research Scholar and the Director for the Center for the Study of Services to Children and Families. Wow, Sarah, you haven't been here that long and you are doing amazing things. Thank you so much for joining us. At this point in time, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you, and you will have the ability to share your screen and control your own presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
All right, there we go. Good morning for all of you joining from BC, and if anyone is joining from outside of BC, good day. I hope everyone is doing well. I will apologize. I have a bit of a cold I'm getting over, so hopefully I'm able to speak clearly. Thank you, Jen, for the introduction. It has been amazing coming here to Canada and trying out all sorts of different things. So today, talking about defying the odds and positive adaptation in the context of adversity. So just a little bit about sort of how I see myself as a researcher. And I consider myself to be a developmental health equity researcher. And what that means is I'm interested in understanding what are the experiences that children and youth are developing in? What are the different contexts that they're developing in? And what are some of the factors that are leading to poor outcomes? What are some of the risks that children are experiencing at multiple levels? Now, I want to be very clear that I try never, sometimes I slip, but I try to never say the term at-risk youth. Rather, I like to think of it and frame it in my head as youth who are experiencing risk, right? And by doing that, what we recognize is that when you say someone is at risk or has a risk, it means they have a greater chance or probability, but it is never a certainty, right? We know that certain risk factors increase the chances that poor outcomes could happen, but we need to always be thinking and looking for the possibility that there are protective factors that are enabling us to pull apart and actually start to look at resilience and positive adaptation. It's really thinking to ourselves from a systems perspective that there are risk and protective factors that are constantly at work with each other that are shaping the way children grow and develop and how they respond to resilience hindering experience or risk experiences in their lives. And so it's important for me as a researcher in this area to think about I'm not just looking, when I talk about health and well-being, I'm not just looking for the absence of negative outcomes, but also trying to understand and trying to find the presence of positive ones, to untangle that relationship and to use a comprehensive, complex way to start pulling apart some of these social phenomena. So ideally, the question that sort of drives me is, how do individuals adapt in the context of adversity? I think about some of the youth that I worked with in clinical practice, and oftentimes you'd hear people say, "Oh, they're not doing the right thing. They're having maladaptive interactions. They're responding, negatively. They have poor outcomes." And I'd like to kind of take a step back and think about those pathways as either successful or unsuccessful in terms of the context in which they're in. And so one of the quotes that I think about as I do this work is by Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor, a psychoanalyst, and he would say an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal. So when we have individuals who are experiencing risk and they end up having poor outcomes, that is what we expect. Now, what I'm interested in is understanding that other side of the coin. For those individuals that have had these bad experiences that are actually showing well-being, that are showing that they're thriving. So this process of resilience. Now, resilience is a term that's used quite often. And so I want to quickly just go over my definition, a definition that I pull from Ann Maston, Michael Unger, two amazing researchers in doing resilience work. And I want us to think about resilience as a dynamic process of how individuals, families, communities do well in the context of adversity. So as we're reading resilience, as we're thinking about resilience, it's important for us to consider where it came from. And so what's interesting is the term resilience stems from the Latin word resilio. And please, I apologize, my Latin is not very good, but it originally goes back to a biologist who used the term to help describe what happened when you would manipulate a cell and it would return to its original functioning. Now, it's not quite as straightforward when we're talking about individuals and social groups, in part because resilience may be happening in one domain of life, but not in another. It may be happening across time. It may be having fluctuations. So really moving our thoughts from, is this person resilient or not, to what are their pathways? What are the processes that we're seeing? And so what that looks like for me when thinking about how children defy the odds, it's really honing in and thinking about the two aspects of this definition: how they do well, and in what adversity they're doing that in. So we look at the risk research to understand what are some of the well-documented risk factors and how are they impacting health and well-being, and then we can look at how they do well to start untangling the impact risk is having and the role that protective factors play in this positive adaptation. So let's first take this term, do well. And so for my research, I'm particularly interested in understanding health and well-being. So by health and well-being, I mean physical health as well as your psychological well-being. And so while I separate them into two groups and kind of recognize that there are multiple dimensions of health and well-being, really I'm thinking of them as one aspect of health and well-being. If you are physically well, but not mentally well, that is going to be a problem for the future. So how healthy are children? This is where we have sort of the doom and gloom, gray clouds appearing behind me, is that children are not doing well in North America. These data, while prior to COVID, are actually much worse now. And so what we're seeing is that in both Canada and the United States, children are not reporting that they have optimal health. Nearly a third of all children are experiencing overweight or obesity. We have high levels of chronic disorders like asthma. And I think one of the most impactful things is that nearly 20% of children have a diagnosis of a mental illness. And so that's not just experiencing symptoms, but actually having a diagnosis of a mental illness. In a recent UNICEF report, so again, pre-COVID, so I can imagine these numbers are probably have gotten worse. Canada was ranked 30th out of 38 countries for overall child and youth health and well-being. So out of 38 affluent countries, countries with healthcare systems, with resources available for families and children, they are only ranking 30th. The United States is even further down at 36. And so it's a significant concern for us, both because child health and well-being is important in its own right, but also because it's a big predictor of adult health conditions as well. So what we know is that nearly two-thirds of all preventable and premature deaths stem from health conditions that were initiated in childhood. So again, these numbers are pre-COVID, so we want to kind of take that into account. Some of this may be slightly different, but the connection is clear that child health and well-being is a strong predictor of quality of life through adolescence and adulthood, and are associated with a number of different poor health outcomes. Now, what are some of the factors that are impacting health and well-being? There are many, and so I use a systems approach, but I primarily focus on those health experience or those adverse experiences that are occurring within the home. So within that family system. These may be acute or chronic. They may be one-time events. But the research consistently shows that there are adverse childhood experiences that are significantly linked to poorer health outcomes. Now, I primarily focus on mental health conditions and substance use within the family. Some of these are changing. For example, divorce is being utilized less often as an ACE, in part because there are some instances where separation can actually be a supportive factor for families, particularly if there happens to be violence within the family. Now, while I focus primarily on these experiences within the home, I also want us to be mindful when we think about the fact that there are these other structural adverse experiences that may be co-occurring. So that can include poverty, that can include oppression due to racism, due to colonization. And all of those different factors are sort of intertangled with each other, right? And so from that systems perspective, we recognize that the child is sort of growing up and developing within their proximal environments, but that all of these different systems hold within them a degree of risk and protective factors. And these risk and protective factors are working together, working against each other, and influencing those pathways to health and well-being. And so it means that we really need to have complex solutions to understand and untangle these complex systems, right? That includes recognizing that health and well-being in itself is not a single indicator. It's a multidimensional construct that has multiple indicators of health and well-being. So in this particular study, I'm really focused on understanding how the child is developing in the context of the family, and in particular, looking at the role of the mother. Now, in this data set, I use the term mother because in this data set that I used, I focused on primary caregivers who identified as a mother, which is why I use this term. Otherwise, I would use caregiver or parent, but in this case, they are just mothers in this sample. The reason why I focus on it, and so we're focusing on middle childhood, the reason why I focus on this particular group is because a lot of the research is focusing on early childhood and adolescence and really forgetting this fundamental phase, a phase where children are still very much enmeshed in the family unit. They're still very much reliant on their parents and caregivers for helping to socialize them, for learning social norms, for developing health promoting behaviors. We want to still see very high levels of well-being in this area. And so in this particular age range, we want to consider what are some of the interactions that are going on, what are some of the risk factors within this family system that may be impacting child health and well-being. And so in this case, I focused on maternal depression. And the reason why I picked maternal depression is because it's not uncommon. In fact, I think the rates of maternal depression have grown exponentially over the past 2 years. When I say maternal depression, I'm not just focused on postpartum depression or peripartum depression, which is that onset that occurs, right around delivery, within that 4 weeks prior to 6 months post-delivery. But really looking at depression as a mental health condition that can have onset at any point during the child's life. The reason why it's a well-documented risk factor and how it's been identified as a well-documented risk factor is that the symptoms associated with depression can significantly impair daily functioning, can make it difficult to take on those daily tasks. As a result, the research has linked maternal depression to poorer psychological well-being in children, poorer physical health, as well as disruptions to the maternal-child relationship. Now, what gets me interested is, great, we have this really nicely established risk factor. This is fantastic for us to know. We understand that, inherent in this experience, children may have a greater chance or greater risk of developing some of these negative outcomes. But as I said at the beginning, it is not a certainty. So in this project, in this study, what I wanted to do is untangle child health and well-being. Oftentimes in this research, we see variable-centered approaches where you have a number of different predictors predicting a single health outcome. So how is maternal depression impacting child psychological well-being? And that provides us a bit of information, right? But in this particular study, I wanted to use an approach called latent profile analysis that would enable me to look at child health and well-being as the multidimensional construct that it is. And in doing so, what we can actually begin to see is that we need to go beyond the healthy, unhealthy dichotomy and actually start thinking about health and well-being as a multidimensional construct. Now, this is important for clinicians as we do our screening measures to think about what are we looking for? What are some of the risks and what are some of the positive outcomes that we need to be looking for in this context? So once I developed those profiles of health and well-being, I then wanted to see how do they differ based on this well-documented risk factor. So I used an amazing data set that has about 5,000 children in it. It includes both maternal mom and child report in these data sets. And so child report started at age 9. So this is the wave that I use to look at child health and well-being, starting with age 9. In this particular data set, about 16% of the population of the moms had a diagnosis of depression, which is about what we would expect to see in the population. So it's pretty comparable. So in this particular data set, they have a number of different variables looking at child health and well-being, maternal health and well-being, and a variety of different sociodemographic characteristics. It's an incredibly rich data set. So what did I do? Well, this is what I looks simple, but is probably a very complicated conceptual model. So I'm going to break it down. My idea is that these are sort of all of the health indicators that we want to be attuned to when we're working with clients who maybe are experiencing risk, right? So we have this mix of physical health and psychosocial indicators. In our physical health, we have overweight and including obesity. We have chronic health conditions. So that included whether or not a child had one reported health problem. That included chronic ear infections, a diagnosis of diabetes, a diagnosis of asthma, or chronic and frequent migraines, diarrhea, or anemia. And so Taken together, we also have a measure of optimal health, right? So recognizing that we aren't just looking for the absence of negative outcomes, we also want to include some positive outcomes. So this is whether or not the child and the mother reports that the kid is experiencing optimal health. So because we did this at age 9, we have the benefit of having both mother and child report and being able to look and see how those two coincide with each other. I then include a number of indicators of psychosocial well-being, including measures of internalizing and externalizing symptomology. So mother reported through the child behavior checklist, and then child reported through the self-description questionnaire. And then lastly, I included 2 measures of pro-social positive health outcomes, right? Again, not just looking for the absence of disease and disorder, but looking for the presence of well-being. So expressiveness is the ability to express their emotions and how they're feeling, and then perseverance being that grit trait, the ability to keep moving forward with a task, even if it gets difficult. So that's probably my favorite indicator. Not supposed to have favorites, but this idea of perseverance or grit is particularly important for us to look for. Now, when you do a latent class analysis, you want to go into it having a predetermined a priori hypothesis of how you think these classes are going to break apart. And so in this analysis, I expected that for our latent profiles, what I would see is a healthy group. So really across all of these indicators, everything is in the direction we want. We're seeing optimal health, low health problems, low internalizing and externalizing, high levels of expressiveness and perseverance. I also anticipated we'd have a group on the other end, sort of the not doing so well group, the poor health group, where we'd see negative, we'd see high rates of health problems and very low rates of some of these optimal health and expressiveness and perseverance. And then I expected that we would have a couple groups, 2 or 3 groups that would be a mix, recognizing that somebody could have resilient or strong positive outcomes in one area of their well-being while showing vulnerability in another, right? So rather than just sort of casting them all into the healthy versus unhealthy, allowing for that nuance in how they're doing. Once these profiles were developed, we then looked at the impact of maternal depression at age 5, so the prior wave, as well as concurrently at age 9. So how is depression that had an onset at age 9 impacting the way individuals fall into these different profiles? So we did a latent profile analysis. That's a person-centered approach. It is both data-driven and theoretically driven. You want to go into these analyses with an idea of how you think your latent classes are going to break out into different groups. And then you use the membership probabilities and item response probabilities to look at those different groups and begin to classify them and name them based on what you're expecting to see in the analysis. So the classes are not known. It's this iterative building up process. And then running a multinomial logistic regression to understand how are these different classes being impacted by maternal depression. So how does this risk factor of maternal depression predict which profile we're in? Again, the hypothesis being that you're experiencing this risk factor, you're probably more likely to be in one of the risk groups. But by allowing for there to be different levels of risk in those groups, you may actually see something a little bit different than through your variable-centered approaches. So in fitting that model, we ended up doing a 5-class solution. And so what this shows us here is that after around class 4, we're not really seeing a decrease in our comparative fit analyses. And we're actually seeing our entropy, which is how well our model is fitting this data. How well does a 5-class solution fit our data versus a 6-class solution? So as we run it, what you do is you look at each discrete class and you determine whether or not adding an additional class is going to provide you with better information. In this case, our 2-class solution followed what I expected. When we ran a 2-class solution, we saw a healthy versus unhealthy group. all all positive outcomes for our healthy group, all sort of negative outcomes for our unhealthy group. But as we allowed these profiles to grow, we actually found some really, really cool stuff where we saw those nuances, those sort of resilient in one area, struggling in another. And so what it ends up looking like, and this is a very simplistic version of it, is that we got these 5 really cool classes. So in our first class, we have our thriving group, right? Good physical, good psychosocial, and the majority of children in the whole sample kind of fell in this category. We then have our poor health group. So what we saw here is we didn't see good health across our positive indicators. We saw high levels of internalizing and externalizing symptomology, high levels of physical health problems, very low levels of optimal health, expressiveness, and perseverance. So those are the 2 groups I expected. Now, this group, our second group, was totally unexpected. This group popped out of nowhere, but it makes sense. So in this particular group, because we allow for both mother and child report, and one of the great things about latent class or latent profile analysis is because it's not a linear approach, it's a finite mixture model, we can have indicators from different respondents and with different response sets. And what it does is we look for the pattern of responses across all those indicators. So it's okay that they're different, different response sets, different respondents. It still provides us some really unique information. And so in this particular group, what we actually found is that what characterized this group is that mom was saying, my kid is healthy, optimal health, very low internalizing and externalizing. But the child was reporting that they actually had very low levels of optimal health and very high levels of internalizing and externalizing symptomology, suggesting to us that there's a disconnect in that parent-child relationship where mom is maybe either not attuned to how the kid is feeling or possibly is not reporting how the kid is doing accurately. There may be some discrepancy there. Our next group is thriving physical, poor psychosocial. Now, this is one I expected to see. And so what we have here is we're seeing across our physical health indicators, very positive outcomes, what we want, very low rates of overweight, low rates of chronic health conditions, high rates of optimal health. But they also are reporting high rates of internalizing and externalizing symptomology. Now, this is important because if you're working with this group, it provides you an opportunity to think about how you could tailor intervention to best fit their needs, which happens to be around their psychological well-being, while maybe building on their strengths of having positive physical health. And then the last group, again, my favorite group, is this one group where we saw poor physical health and this struggling psychosocial, in that we saw high rates of internalizing and externalizing, but that perseverance score, that perseverance scale that we had in there was the second highest only to the thriving group. Meaning that while this group is showing some pretty negative outcomes across a number of different health indicators, they're also showing really high rates of perseverance, which suggests to me that had I done an assessment on individuals, this 10% of individuals, and I only assessed for risk, I did not include some assessment for strengths or assets, I would have considered these individuals to be in poor health. I would have missed something incredibly important. And so these groups end up looking much more complicated. I love this figure. Most people see it and they're like, what the heck is it? But essentially what you're seeing here is you can kind of see those profiles expanded, where you have your thriving group, very high levels of optimal health. So these are your optimal health indicators, very low levels of overweight or health conditions, low levels of internalizing and externalizing, both mother reported in blue, child reported in orange, and these high levels of perseverance and expressiveness. So again, our poor physical, struggling psychosocial, we see this incredibly high level of perseverance. It's higher than all the other groups, and almost as high as the thriving group. So this particular profile is interesting in that it provides us some unique perspective on that sort of multidimensional, where maybe we're not seeing resilience in one area, but we're seeing these strengths in another. So what about our risk factor? Well, when we look at these different profiles and how they unfold, what we see is pretty consistent with the literature, that having a mom with depression increases this chance of being in one of these poor health groups. So we see these higher rates of being in poor health, both for 5-year depression, 9-year depression, as well as for these changes. So this is depression at both years. We're seeing the highest percent here, and they're less likely to be in this thriving group. But what interests me is we still have about 50% of our sample who is experiencing this risk and still showing positive health outcomes. And so these are just bivariate analyses. And when we run a multinomial logistic regression, we can actually look at the relative risk ratios. So that tells us that when looking at the risk of being in one of these risk profile groups, the chance of being in one of these risk profile groups, with maternal depression as the key predictor, and these models all control for a number of sociodemographic characteristics and are weighted to control for the sampling design of the study. But what we see here is a fairly consistent relationship that having this sort of current maternal depression was associated with being in one of these risk groups as compared to being in the thriving group. Now, what I found interesting here is that, so 1 is our level for significance. So anytime the bar crosses over the level 1, it means that our relative risk ratio is not significant. So this was our discrepant group. Now, when I found this group, I predicted that we would have, that maternal depression would be associated with being in this group, that moms with depression may be less in tune to their kids' well-being, and they would end up here. And that's not what we found. We actually didn't find that maternal depression was associated with being in this discrepant group. So possibly because we were asking about symptoms like internalizing and externalizing symptoms, it could be that moms who are experiencing depression may be attuned to seeing those symptoms in their children. Now that's completely speculation, a hypothesis on my part, and it needs to be further examined. But again, when we're thinking about risk, we want to allow for possibilities that there may be other experience and underlying net risk factors. So this was kind of interesting to us. Now, when we look at sort of this remits, so that means they had depression at year 5, but not at year 9. Onset, meaning they didn't have it at year 5, they got it at year 9. And then chronic, meaning that mom was diagnosed with depression at both time periods. Again, we're seeing this chronic depression is associated with 6.74 times greater risk of being in the poor health group as compared to the thriving group. So relative risk ratios are really interesting, but let's look at the predicted probabilities, which provides us the predicted probability that someone will end up in one of these groups if their mom has 5-year depression. And I want you to sort of consider here that 55, the predicted probability of being in the thriving group when experiencing maternal depression at year 5, you still had 56%, almost 56% of the population in this thriving group, which means that something else is going on. It means that there are some other protective factors at play that are enabling individuals to avoid. This would almost be your resilient group right here. This is the group that has defied the odds. Now, this group, while experiencing poor health, they didn't fail. They haven't failed to be resilient. They just weren't captured being resilient at this point in time. And I like the notion of saying they haven't been captured being resilient because it leaves that door open. Again, we have to remember an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal. So having poor health when experiencing a risk factor is not a failure to be resilient, but rather we haven't put in place yet the protective factors necessary to see this shift to being in this thriving group. Now, this was the lagged effect. So this is 5-year depression predicting well-being at age 9. When we look at concurrent depression, so 9 years, so mom's currently depressed at when the child is 9, and this is their well-being at 9. Again, we see a slight decrease, suggesting that interconnection between maternal mental health and child health and well-being. What I think is incredibly fascinating here is we don't have much of a change in our poor health group, but rather we're actually seeing this group sort of pop out. This group is sort of emerging. And remember, this is our group with that grit. So maybe they're experiencing some notable declines in their health and well-being, expected given that they're experiencing risk, but they still have this degree of perseverance, which provides us as clinicians an opportunity to sort of identify that perseverance and build off of that strength, really being able to balance the overall picture of their health and well-being. Now, for this particular data set, my next step is to really think about this group right here, this 50%, half of the sample, and understanding what are some of the factors that are enabling them to stay in this thriving group. As we talked about, there are multiple risk factors across multiple systems. So part of the next steps for this research is to understand what are the risk profiles for this group. Are they only experiencing maternal depression? And what are some of the other factors that are in their lives that are enabling them to stay in this thriving group? So we talked about ACEs, but I also want us to think about BCs. So benevolent childhood experiences or promotive childhood experiences. And so what are some of these factors? Are some of these experiences present to allow this group to be here, to provide that support in order for them to remain in this thriving group? Is there at least one other adult or caregiver that's providing them with supports? It could also be that when we think about maternal depression, for all my fellow clinicians out there, we know that the symptom profile for depression can be varied. There are a number of different symptoms, and so you may have some symptoms that are more associated with some of these negative health outcomes. Maybe mom has gotten treatments, maybe she has a diagnosis of mental illness, but because she has treatment, that's one of those protective factors. Ideally, the next step is to be able to understand how are these different factors changing that pathway, changing that, enabling youth to thrive in the context of risk. And so a quick summary, what was nice about this is the results, while aligned with the findings around maternal depression as a risk factor, also provided us some additional important information around what we should look for health and well-being. That having a negative outcome in one aspect, one domain of health, does not mean that a child is not resilient. It does not mean that they're not defying the odds. It means that, at that point, they're still experiencing the risk. So being able to understand that association between maternal mental health and child well-being needs to take the next step to move beyond the healthy versus unhealthy dichotomy to allow for those different nuances. And then also really reminds us that we need to be assessing for more than just risk. When we're assessing, we need to include some of those strengths. So I think a lot of assessments in clinical practice have moved in this way, where they're starting to include both the needs and the strengths when doing those assessments. Finally, I think what's really important here, and I hope this was clear, maternal depression as an experience is not uncommon, and we're not blaming moms. What we recognize is that the family system embedded within these broader systems are experiencing these negative outcomes. And so we have an opportunity then to put into place resources that can help mom and child, or caregiver and child. And rather than just focusing on how can we improve child health, we need to have that multi-generational approach. We need to think about how children are embedded within their families, how families are embedded within community, and how policies support families and children in those contexts. So wrapping up, one of the most important things when we think about promoting resilience and we think about ways that we can move children into that thriving group is one, to reduce those risk exposures. So this is a little picture, the story of the lion with the thorn in his paw. And so when we're trying to promote resilience, when we're trying to promote well-being for youth, we have to first think about removing that thorn. We have to think about how can we assess those risk factors. So in this case, reducing risk exposures or removing the thorn could be making sure that caregivers have access to mental health care, making sure that they have access to screening. So oftentimes we'll see parents and caregivers who put their own health aside to take care of their children, and making sure that we're providing supports maybe within the child's family care doctor that enable parents to be part of that healing process and part of that process of becoming well and having well-being. The reality is that with many of our risk factors, especially those structural risk factors, we are expecting healing or resilience to occur with the thorn still in the paw. So we have a lot of policy work in that regard to help remove that thorn. The other factor is boosting some of those resources. So that's really the next step for this research, is understanding what are the biggest predictors of individuals being in that thriving group, right? When there are multiple risk factors, what are those protective factors that sort of balance the scales back out to where youth are able to continue to develop and have positive health outcomes, even in the face of having risk. And then lastly, thinking about how we nurture and mobilize those basic adaptive systems. So that includes both within the child, their learning and thinking. It also includes, the weight that we put on cultural practices and education systems and community supports, knowing that these basic adaptive systems may not be equally distributed to all individuals. So how can we bolster community resources in areas where maybe they don't have as much? Maybe they're in a food desert. Maybe they don't have good access to care. How can we sort of mobilize these basic adaptive systems? So all of this, I think, this research is exciting to me. Most of it was done pre-COVID. And so right now I'm currently working on some analyses that look at how this is unfolding in a global pandemic and how it's unfolding among Canadian children. So stay tuned, and I will have more hopefully to come. I'll be able to replicate these profiles with a different sample of youth and begin to sort of untangle, how are children developing? How are they defying the odds? And what are those protective factors that we can help put in place as clinicians, as policymakers, as educators, as parents, or as caregivers? So thank you so much. If you have, I think, time for questions, I threw my Twitter handle up here. As I do research, I tend to post it on Twitter. So feel free to follow. And thank you so much. I'm imagining you are all sitting in your home offices applauding me on my fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. That's wonderful. All right, I just want to remind individuals that the chat box is open. So if you have some questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and then I can convey them to Sarah and she can go about answering them for you. There's a couple here coming in. Many thank yous that I've received both through the host panelist as well as the chat. But Lori Swanson, pardon me, indicated that she appreciated the content and the references, especially with respect to BCEs and or PCEs. And she's going to follow up and incorporate that into some of her trauma work. So thank you for sharing that with us, Lori. I do have one question for you, Sarah, and I'm wondering if you would mind commenting a little bit on the work that you're doing with maternal health, and you were talking about other factors and groups and individuals surrounding those factors. I'm wondering if any of your data analysis explored the partner in the situation, whether it be the husband or partner or another significant adult in the house at the time, and their role within some of those dynamic switches between groups.
Yeah. So that's a great, and that is the next step. And so unfortunately with this data set, it was predominantly with moms who were single. So I think at baseline, it was sampled for that. However, within that data set, there are indicators of cohabitation and subsequent relationships and the quality of those relationships. And so that is the next step, because we do see in the research that having another caregiver, having another caring adult, not even a caregiver, having another caring adult in a person's life can help buffer some of those risk factors. So whether it's a teacher, a caregiver, sometimes an older sibling, all of those factors can actually be incredibly supportive for a child growing up. And so I think one of the messages I want to give here is, I would venture guess, I am not a parent, but I would venture guess every parent, every caregiver is going to have a bad day, is going to experience a health concern. And to know that you're not damaging your kid, right? That's not the message that I want to give here, but that there are additional resources that need to be put in place to support you as a person who's experiencing this, as well as supporting other members within the family. But again, I've pulled it out and I've distilled it down to this one dyadic relationship, but in reality, need to sort of expand it to think about this, to think about all the relationships that are going on for individuals.
So true. It takes, somebody once said, and probably a famous person, I can't remember, it takes a community to raise a child. Yes. So I can see where that you're tying these together, and it's so interesting. And on that note, there's a question: were you able to look at poverty or socioeconomic status and whether it predicted any of the profiles?
Yes, so that is another important next step. So we did, in those models looking at maternal depression, we controlled for socioeconomic status. So we had a measure of poverty to income ratio. And we definitely see a pattern that's very similar to what you're seeing in the literature, where the more impoverished a family is, the greater the chance that the child was going to be in one of those risk profiles. And it makes sense when we're looking at the way we look at health and well-being in particular. It makes sense in that we can understand that a lack of resources may increase the chances that both mom and child are going to be experiencing some negative side effects or negative effects of that experience.
Okay, thank you. That adds a lot to the dynamic switches that we're seeing. And there's a comment here about the significance of secure attachment, and the comments that they love, the comment about protective factors, building resilience. And are you starting to see that across those two groups in particular, the protective factors? And can you speak maybe a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so in terms of secure attachment, we didn't measure attachment in this data set. However, when it comes to looking at those protective factors, one of the next steps that I have is to look at how some of those known benevolent childhood experiences may be uniquely buffering specifically against the risk of maternal depression. So in another paper that's currently under review, we actually looked at the maternal-child relationship as a mediating relationship for mothers with depression and their parenting behavior. So discipline of their child and involvement. And that maternal-child relationship or parent-child relationship was a key predictor. And what was interesting is that the involvement of the parent was not much different, but rather parents with depression were more likely to view themselves as being less competent, even though they were engaging in very similar activities. So I think partly by having this balanced conversation between risk and protective factors, we can start having conversations with parents and caregivers in a way that enables them to see their strengths and not just their limitations, which I think is a huge shift in the way we're talking about caregiving and caregiving relationships.
Yeah, that direct participatory action is really important. You identified like the positive factors and how those positive factors contribute to resilience and growth. What about the positive factors that also contribute to part of the negative factors? So for example, if we look at physical activity might be the thriving and the growing part for the child, but some physical activity, especially now I'm seeing a lot in social media here in Kelowna, the influence of body shaming and some of the female triad and weight issues with respect to young female athletes. Can you speak to that element of both positive and negative as it creates a tug of war on resilience?
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I love using the term adaptation rather than resilience or vulnerability, but really just recognizing that there is this sort of pathway that people are taking. It also pushes me as a researcher. So I can sit with a big data set. Give me a big data set and let me, think of these hypotheses and then run them. And I have these gorgeous, huge numbers. But at the end of the day, being able to pair that with a qualitative study that really digs down into that, I think screen time is a huge concern right now, right? So we talk about screen time, and oftentimes we measure screen time as just that. It's just screen time, right? And like we saw with health and well-being, there are nuances within that general construct, right? So screen time, where maybe you're mindlessly scrolling through an algorithm that promotes a body type that is never going to be your body type, that's going to probably be negative. But if you're talking with, I have an amazing group of colleagues. I see actually in the panelists, Luz Marie, who is one of my Boston College colleagues, but I have an amazing chat where I can talk to my colleagues. And so in that case, that screen time is incredibly beneficial. Right. So part of our job as clinicians and as policymakers is to kind of take a step back and think about how are these factors being promoted in context for this person. So that person and environment fit is so incredibly important. But if we're not asking about it, if we're not thinking about what are the positives and the negatives, right? So not just risk assessments, but strength assessments, we miss some really important factors that we might be able to build on. We might be able to actually mobilize resilience by building on strong community factors, by building on internal assets and family strengths that could be really incredibly beneficial, but we may miss if we're only focused on risk.
I think that's a great message. We have a couple minutes here left. So I guess that could be your closing message because it's very positive and I think offers a lot of insight to the attendees. But I'm wondering if you'd like to close with kind of maybe your takeaway from your research, whether it be as a parent, as another researcher, or even as a member of the community who interacts with really everyone, because we are members of various communities. What would be your message for building really positive and resilient youth?
Yeah, so that is the question I think we all have on our mind, particularly in the context of COVID and the fact that we are all struggling. I think one of the important messages here that I want to sort of relay is looking for strengths, looking for resilience, promoting resilience has a fine line between, there's a fine line between that and toxic positivity. So experiencing sadness, experiencing poor health, experiencing negative outcomes does not mean you're inherently not resilient. It doesn't mean that you are inherently incapable of outcomes that are positive, but really, trying to hammer home that resilience is a dynamic process. It's an ebb and flow. You can think of it as sort of the waves. And some of us have a bit smaller waves, fewer peaks and valleys. And some of us have much higher peaks and valleys. And so part of understanding what it means to be resilient and to building resilient communities is to understand your ability to kind of move through those peaks and valleys, and understand a community's ability to move through those peaks and valleys, but also recognizing that having time to mourn, to grieve. I'm thinking about some of the people who have been affected by the wildfires here in BC. You are not expected to become resilient tomorrow. You can take that time, and you should take that time to experience the trauma, to experience the negative outcomes, and then to be able to move forward with supports, right? It's nothing we do alone. It's something that comes from those protective factors, those resources that we can mobilize on our behalf. So for parents out there who have a child who is, struggling, finding those routines, talking to kids. I think kids have a lot more to say than what we give them credit for. Is one of the reasons why I used both mother and child reports in these analyses. Asking kids what they need and listening when you ask. I think that's a huge thing that can go a long way. And to not assume that your kid can't handle it, because most likely if something is going on in your family or in your home, they know something's not going well. And so to not talk about it is going to probably elevate the stress. So having that open dialogue, using, accessing clinicians, seeking out those resources, can provide families with the necessary resources for growth.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to take this opportunity at this point, because we're running out of time and you're running out of voice. You've done very well considering the cold and everything that you're experiencing. So thank you, Sarah, for taking time and sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the guests today for attending, and remind you as well that you will receive an email with a link to an online evaluation form. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Sarah. And if you'd like to learn more about our upcoming events from the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention, we've got many, many events coming up in the next few months, and they're posted on the future events website for the Institute. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon or evening, wherever you're joining us from. Take care.